Stacy started.
Good evening, thanks for coming. I'm not your teacher tonight, that'll be next week with me and Marla. Janet is teaching tonight, so you'll get a good lesson from her. I've watched her prepare it diligently for the last couple of weeks. Before we get started, I have some news. Probably most of you know what's gone on with several members of our congregation the last few days. It's been quite a trying time. Matt Johnson remains in the hospital. He's making improvement from what I'm told by Daisy. I talked to Sandra today. Jeff Humphers is doing better, and I think will come home tomorrow, if I recall the information correctly. Mark Phelps is home, and they'll be preparing for further treatment for him. Most of you know that Derek Tharp, his father, was killed in a car accident yesterday. And they have asked that we announce that the funeral arrangements are at 10 o'clock in Tahlequah on Saturday. So for those of you who would like to know that, and apparently the service is going to be held at the Church of Christ where they attended. So if you'd like more information, that's just about it, but if there's anything else I can provide, see me afterward and I'll let you know. So, with that, let's have a prayer and then we'll turn it over to Janet. Lord, we thank you so much for the day and for the hour that you've given us to be together, to study, to encourage one another. Lord, our hearts are heavy with the things that have happened to those of our church family. We know it's such a difficult time for Matt and for Mark and for Jeff and for Derek and the sudden unexpected loss of his father. We ask that you bless those who are hurting, comfort them, and give them the peace that you can give them that we cannot, and that only you fully understand. You know their hurts, you know their fears, you know their anger, you know their grief. And we ask that you provide healing and provide comfort and solace. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Good evening. I am going to talk tonight, kind of continue along the generations theme that Ben has started with us. And I want to talk tonight about how generations work.
What?
Oh, I had it upside down. I thought I was following his directions.
Next week's presentation is on technology.
I'll listen carefully. So anyway, what are we doing tonight? We're going to look at how generations work. And the idea of this is to look at generally how generations work and how the cycle of generations work. And we're going to look at each of those cycles. I hope to give a little bit of basic information, and the idea is to look at what's helpful, see how it can help us relate with each other and work together better, and to understand each other better. Some of my information has come from previous lesson of Ben's that he forwarded the link to me and I listened to. Another one is the book that he's referenced a couple of times, Faithful Generations. And that really is an interesting book, and it's a real quick read. If you guys are interested, I'd recommend it. The other bit of my information is from this book called Generations, and it's by these guys who have posited this 4-generational cycle that we're going to look at tonight. And it really is interesting. Scott Robertson told us about this book about 3 or 4 years ago, and so he really knows a lot more about this than I do, but he's not here, so I get to do it. Anyway, I want to start with a quote from the introduction of the book. We will describe what they call the peer personality of each generation. You may share many of the attributes, some of them, or almost none of them. Every generation includes all kinds of people. You and your peers share the same age, location, and history. And your generation's collective mindset cannot help but influence you, whether you agree with it or spend a lifetime battling against it. So, this is the cycle of the 4 different types of generations. And did I email you I intended to email you copies of that. So you guys, I should have checked in my sent email to see if I remembered to do that. But I was planning on giving you guys each a copy of this so you could kind of look at it as we went through the 7 generations that our congregation holds to kind of see where everybody falls. But basically, this first generational type that we're talking about is the Civic Generation. And there's some kind of big struggle in the world or in the country to which they respond. The next generation is the Adaptive Generation. And basically, that generation respects what was done in the previous generation, and they honor it and keep it going while making some tweaks to things that they see aren't quite right. Then the third generation that comes along in this cycle is the Idealist. And the idea is things are going pretty well, but it could be better. There's a lot of questioning of values, and there are some radical changes. And then the last one is the Reactive group. And they're basically stuck with the changes that were made in the generation before. Some of it works, a lot of it's bad. And they tend to be cynical and pragmatic. And then the cycle starts all over again. So kind of looking at how this works, I want to look at a well-known biblical multi-generational story. So we start with the Civic group, which is the Exodus group. And this is the group that, they were enslaved in Egypt. Things were terrible. Pharaoh didn't like them. So Moses comes. He leads them away. They wanted to survive. They overcame a lot of obstacles, made some poor decisions. They didn't really create the problems that ended them up in Egypt, but they went with them and they survived. Then came the Adaptive group, which were the ones that Joshua led them actually across the Jordan and on into the Promised Land. They build the cities, they respect the laws of Moses, and they continue the story and they inherit the Promised Land, and they build on those circumstances. And then along comes this upheaval group. These are the ones who said, yeah, but we think we can do this a little better. We don't have to act like we were the descendants of Egyptian slaves. And we're going to do things different. Well, change isn't always bad, but in that case it was bad because they turned away from God. They adopted the gods of the Philistines and ended up not knowing God, which led them to be enslaved by various groups. And then this cycle goes on and on through 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, just this cycle. Okay? So that gives us a little background. So how does this apply to us? Now, these colors don't coincide with those ones on the previous slide, but I thought this was a really good... Is everything okay? A good representation of where the generations fall for us. So we do have 7 generations in our congregation here. And the years of the beginning and end of each generation, it changes a little bit depending on the source. So some of those numbers may be a little different than you'd seen. And each generational cycle is anywhere between 12 to 23 years, and they share similar circumstances and formative experiences like parenting, cultural trends, religious beliefs, politics, war, things like that. Now, there are some exceptions, like with any rules, right? So the family we grew up in, possibly the community that we lived in, may be a little different than some of these. And so the numbers may look a little different for you individually, or the traits may look a little different for you individually. But the idea is how, as a generational group, we're looking at. Now, some of these do contain some stereotypes, and so if we look at grouping people just based on one thing, that can be kind of hard. But it's a really helpful tool as long as you remember that we're looking at traits and remembering that what we're trying to do is understand each other better as individuals and kind of how we perceive the world. So let's start off with the greatest generation. And this generation is somewhere around 100 years old, north or south. Okay? This was the crisis generation that we looked at first. They came of age during World War II and the Great Depression, and it has almost disappeared. But one of the reasons this is called the greatest generation is because they really shaped the 20th century by their response to crisis. So they showed remarkable determination in how they rallied behind, not only went to war, but factories changed, everybody, of course, I wasn't alive then. I'm preaching to the choir. Some of y'all lived through that and understand that. But they really had the passion and willingness to fight for what they thought was right, just because they thought it was the right thing to do. And they really wanted to make America a better place to live. So if we're kind of looking at the themes of the greatest generation, a motto might be, there's a crisis and we will respond. And an appropriate theme song might be My Way. The message of that song is like their lives were full and eventful. They made hard choices, and most of them were good ones. They were unapologetic about their choices and honest about their sacrifices and losses. Now, it's interesting, well, I thought it was, to note that at this age, music really didn't have the emotion. It wasn't an emotional expression like it was for later generations and like it is now. So a lot of people in this generation didn't identify with a specific song. However, that song in the 70s was the most requested non-secular song to be played at funerals. So it was when this generation really started going, that this song really kind of, evidently the people who were choosing the songs for the funeral really thought that this embodied them. Let me read some words from verse 2. And no, I won't sing. Colin, you want to come sing? Regrets, I've had a few, but then again too few to mention. I did what I had to do and saw it through without exception. Yes. I planned each charted course, each careful step along the byway, and much more than this, I did it my way. So the next group we have is the adaptive group, and this is the silent generation. And people in this generation now are in their mid-70s to early 90s. I am going to read a little bit from this book before each of these generations because I think it's important what they have to say. If you are a silent, you are part of an other-directed generation that comes more easily to an appreciation of the mindsets, virtues, and flaws of those born before or behind you. You need less persuasion than others to accept a typology of generations, a theory of historic oscillation, and the need for balance and diversity in any story of progress. So the reason this group was called the silent generation is they really said very little, and they worked hard to survive. World War II and the Great Depression were part of their past, but they really didn't, this group didn't really affect those. They did live them. So they saw the work of the previous generation as good and important. Remember, the idea with the adaptive generation is they really honor what came before and tweak it as needed. This group is seen as optimistic. They looked for social justice, although at that time social justice did not look like it does now. But they really did feel that social justice was important. And they carried the characteristics of respect and thriftiness that their parents had established. So when we're looking at things for this group, their motto could be summed up to be, yes, sir. You need me to do it, I'll do it. And the song, America the Beautiful, speaks both to love of country and their desire to reform it. Just kind of tweak it a little bit. Oh, beautiful for pilgrim feet, whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare of freedom beat across the wilderness. America, America, God mend thy every flaw, confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. And so now we come to my generation, the boomers. People in this generation are late 50s to mid 70s, and this is known as an idealist generation. And the boomers grew up mostly at the beginning of the Cold War. Primary experience of the world was the injustice and what this group saw as the hypocrisy of 1950s America. And they were the first generation to really express their feelings through music. And they were formed by outrage and rebelling against the status quo, the free love, the communes, the hippies, all of that. So let me read out of this book what he has to say about the boomer generation. If you are a boomer, you know yours is, beyond doubt, an authentic generation. You will recognize the generational boundaries separating you from others. You have no trouble recognizing how other generations have personalities very different from your own. But the great comfort you derive from your own identity is precisely what makes your generation troubling in the eyes of others. So I don't know if you guys, well, most of y'all won't remember. I won't go there. Okay, so basically, baby boomers were idealistic, goal-oriented, and competitive, and ended up being bureaucratic. A lot of the things that they wanted to change and the protest for all the many different ways they protested, they ended up kind of conforming and ending up joining the bureaucracy. And it really adapted to what previous generations had done, because as a generation, the boomers really lacked the ability to make any lasting change deep down. And they became part of the establishment despite their early efforts. Part of it is because boomers were used to the prosperity that was established by their parents. So they went from this meta to mini, which is from trying to change the whole society to what can I do to improve myself? A lot of self-improvement and self-actualization became important as this group aged and turned inward. So we came up with a lot of these New Age religions, transcendental meditation, Eastern mysticism, growth of cults, all of those things kind of developed because of this mindset. So themes for baby boomers. Things aren't as great as you thought they were, and a good song might be the times they are a-changin'. So the motto and the song both represent, they both speak to the frustration for how things are and the desire to make it better. They said, get out of the way, here we come. And like I said, that kind of changed a little bit. But some words from that song. Come mothers and fathers all over the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are a-changin'. Then we get to Generation X, which a number of you are in here. So this is an authentic generation. Remember, this is kind of the stuck generation. My generation made a bunch of changes and kind of messed things up, and so Generation X came along. Generation X generally doesn't like labels, even generational ones. And these were the first generation whose parents widely used the pill. And so indirectly, a message that a lot of these kids got was, children are a burden. We can make a choice to not deal with them. So it made them feel like they could be avoided and were a burden. And incidentally, divorces of parents of this generation was way up too. So people in this generation are generally early 40s to mid 50s. And this is also the last generation specifically spoken to in this book. If you are a Gen Xer, we can imagine a cautious reception. Here we are, and these are the authors writing, of course. Two writers from a generation you don't especially like, they're baby boomers. laying bare your generation's problems and affixing a label with an ominous ring. You may not like being lumped in with mall rats, drug gangs, and collegians who can't find Chicago on a map, but you will grudgingly admit that that's how others often see you. Not that's how you are, but that is how you are perceived sometimes. So like I said, the divorces were up in the parents of this generation. So there were more broken homes, there was less stable family, a lot more latchkey kids, and there was kind of a despair over the fate of the earth started in this generation. Intolerance of authority figures, and often they felt lost and left behind. They have a sense of being betrayed, and so they're determined to not betray. They value music and art, and expression of their feelings is reflected. And they have a strong sense of survival, which reflects their longing for security. As opposed to their parents, they value a more life-work balance and don't put as much value on jobs. It's up until this generation, the idea was, I live to work. And with this generation, it started turning to, I work so I can live. The baby boomers and before, the idea was, I want to enjoy my work because that's who I am, that's what I am. But it's really not that for this generation, and the trend grows increasingly the other way as the generations go on. And it really is more live to work. So looking at themes of Generation X, the world is a mess, but we can't change anything. They're looking at how ingrained the culture is. And they have a difficult time figuring out how to go about changing things in a systemic manner, and tend to feel stuck. So the words from the song: goodness gracious, not many people care. Concern is getting scarcer. True compassion really rare. I can see it on our faces, I can feel it in the air. Goodness gracious me. Goodness gracious, my generation's lost. They burned down all our bridges before we had a chance to cross. Is it the winter of our discontent, or just an early frost? It's kind of sad, huh? So then we come to the generation that we all still think of as kids, and they're millennials. But like they're in their mid-20s to early 40s now. Not kids, not kids. Now, note also that the name millennials is in two colors. And the reason for that is because researchers have not really determined if they are indeed the next civic generation, or if that civic generation was skipped over and they became the adaptives. I would imagine, this book was written in '91, so a lot has changed since then, but then I've also read some more recent stuff. And they're tending to think, especially with the pandemic and some other things that have happened in the last year, that this generation really is turning into a civic generation. But I think that will only be told looking way back. Because there really wasn't, until recently, there really wasn't a world-altering dilemma to overcome. I mean, there was 9/11, but it didn't change the day-to-day life for most of us. If we fly on airplanes, it changed that, and it changed a few other things, but it wasn't the life-altering globally that World War II and the Great Depression were. Interesting, the authors of this book, like I said, it was written in 1991. Hold on, let me pull it up. They, because of the study of generations, and they've gone back way into the 1500s and done this, so they have really picked up on some really interesting trends. They actually said, enter the crisis of 2020. It says, the climactic event may not arrive exactly in the year 2020, but it won't arrive much sooner or later. And then it talks about how old each generation will be when the crisis arrives. And then they finished that little part with, the crisis of 2020 will be a major turning point in American history and an adrenaline-filled moment of trial. At its climax, Americans will feel that the fate of posterity for generations to come hangs in the balance. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic, I'm talking about the civil unrest that has come to light that hasn't come to light. There's really been a focus on it. And those things, and that was 2020. And I just think it really is interesting and kind of a confirmation of this generational theory and the cycles of everything that, boy, they were able to pinpoint that just to the specific year. So, like I said, question mark about there being a world-altering dilemma. And this group was born at a time when technology was really taking its true shape. And with life being more global and following the expansion of acceptance and tolerance by Gen X, diversity is truly important to this group. And like I said before, it looks way different than it did 4 generations ago. So connection also looks a lot different with this group. Virtual relationships are true relationships. You know, we in our older generation look at it, well, how can you be friends with somebody in Africa that you only talk to once a week and you don't even have face-to-face conversation with? That's the way it is. They really are true. Now the downside to this increase in technological relationships is that sometimes this has affected the level of interpersonal skills, and it's been showing up in the job market. So like I said before, social justice is really important to this group, but it does have a different meaning than it did to earlier generations. In earlier generations, each group had a role, and it was important to have justice within that role. Well, now, with the diversity, the globalization, each individual has a role, and we need to look at the individual as a person, not how they are in that group. This group, optimism is a key characteristic, and family is really, really important, although family looks different than it did to previous generations. What's it called? Well, I can't remember what they call it, but the idea of the chosen family has really evolved in this generation. Even if a person has really close ties with their own family, they often have their chosen family also of friends. They don't cross out the other, but they're both equally important. And this group is also less religious than the generation before. So let's look at a motto. It could be whatever, not whatever I don't care, but whatever, never mind, you don't get it. Looking at us, of course. All those themes have emerged as this generation evolves. And due to the speed of information and change that's hallmark of this generation, they're really impatient. They're impatient to get information, they're impatient for change, and they're impatient for us old people who are slow to evolve. Songs, so there was some discussion as to what the theme song was. They had like, I don't know, 5 or 6 that they thought, we really don't know which one. So I chose 2 of them, okay? One of them is We've Got Some Soul, and some of you guys may know this song. I've never heard, it's on my phone now, but I've never listened to it. Well, I did once. I'd rather be broke than brain dead, living in my parents' basement. Nobody knows, nobody knows. My friends are all hitched and happy. I'm working all week, but my ends don't meet. It's all the same, I could use a break. Hey, we know we'll never see the money, so we go. We're better on our own. Or you've got the other end of this, which is, I want things now because everything is important to have right now, and it's accessible for now. And it's from Willy Wonka. Now, I want the world. I want the whole world. I want to lock it up in my pocket. It's my bar of chocolate. Give it to me now. I want today. I want tomorrow. So mix those 2 songs, and I guess maybe we've got what Generation X looks like. I mean, millennials look like, I'm sorry. So now we go to Gen Z. And believe it or not, some of these people are in their early 20s, so they're not kids anymore either. They are the young adults. And just like with the previous generation, it remains to be seen where they're going to fit in the cycle. Are they going to be adaptive, or are they going to be idealist? And we also really don't know what the long-term effect of the pandemic is going to be on this generation. So, Gen Z, always multitasking, they're goal-oriented and pragmatic, and they hope to avoid past mistakes by earlier generations. And they tend to live more slowly than earlier generations too. Interesting to note, they have lower pregnancy rates, they consume alcohol less often, but the same is not true for addictive drugs. They are ethically diverse. They see people as people, not as any group. And they have continued this trend of being less religious, but are considered spiritually minded. The huge amount of information at their disposal has affected their sense of concentration, so they're always multitasking. They were the first generation of touch screens, and they cherish face-to-face and virtual contact. If they need information, like with the previous generation, it's here right away, and they're, I would say, probably better at accessing it than even the previous generation too. So the downside of that is they tend to side with whichever opinion they hear first. Because, boy, it's there, I'm going to look it up, and that's where my opinion is. They may seem to not have time for serious stuff and work, but experts theorize they really are goal-oriented and pragmatic, which kind of makes them like the silent generation, that adaptive generation that we looked at. And like millennials, they see their jobs as means to an end, and their focus is really driven, kind of financially driven, by looking at what the crash, the recession of 2008 did to their parents' retirement incomes and all of that, and they're saying, I don't want to be stuck in that. So they're entrepreneurial, and they're not afraid to chase ideas, and they're competitive, both against themselves, with others, in video games. They're just really competitive. And they really want to control their own destiny. They're not really fans of collaboration. So all of those workplaces that opened up when the boomers were in their heyday, where everybody was in this one big room and they all had cubicles, or they all shared a table and worked collaboratively, well, that's not going to work so much with Gen Z, despite the fact that in school we've tried to help them learn how to collaborate. That's just really not so much their cup of tea. So the question is, I'm not sure what the themes are. They haven't really come up with anything. Maybe life is hard, my only hope is me. And looking back, it's hard to identify a song. Those of you in Generation Z, what do y'all think would be a good song? See, this is really funny because more than any other generation, Gen Z doesn't really want to be labeled. And so it's like they don't want to say, well, I'm going to hang my hat on this thing, right? Yes, no? Or y'all just don't want to talk? Huh?
I don't know if there's any in here.
Well,
There's one.
Yeah.
yeah,
Lainey?
there's just one, and Lainey's not going to talk. Okay. Okay, the next group I really don't have personal experience with, and they are the 7th generation that we have here in church. So what I know, I will share with you, and then I'd like some input. The oldest, obviously, in this generation is only 9 years old. And this generation is likely to span till the mid-2020s. and it really remains to be seen what this generation is going to reflect. They are completely digital natives. So a lot of these kids have had a social media presence even before their birth. 40% of Gen Z or moms created social media accounts before their kids, before the kid's first birthday. So these kids are going to grow up knowing how to manage their social presence and knowing how to have multiple social presences. They are called the indoor generation. Not sure how much of that is because of technology and how much of that's because of the pandemic. I think probably a little bit of both. And how that's going to change, I don't know. Researchers anticipate that their lives will be different in these ways. They will know how to manage their online presence from a very young age. Their school experience will be more individualized and technology driven, and I think that's been sped up by the pandemic as schools have really had to embrace technology. Their skills as adults will be much more specialized. They will be extremely comfortable with artificial intelligence. How many kids this age have Alexa in their homes, or their parents have Siri on their phones? And the kids are completely comfortable. Hey Alexa, hey Siri, have Roombas, you know, those automatic vacuum cleaners. My hearing aids just went on. I said Siri, and my phone thought I was talking. Sorry. Oh, this is distracting. Siri's talking to me.
You said it again.
We're saying that word.
I know. I think she's done. Okay, telemedicine will be the norm. And this group will expect customized experiences from every sector. I don't know, and maybe hearing aids that talk to you will be something everybody wears. I don't know. So as far as who knows what the motto of this group is, and who knows what their song might be. I mean, right now it's Baby Shark, but I don't think I don't think that's going to stick. So parents of kids this age, what do you guys see? Or grandparents of kids this age?
Well, let me tell you, sorry. Go ahead. I was just gonna say, Tanisha was telling me a story today about Deja. They were meeting with a new babysitter. And so she said, Deja said, Alexa, play zombie music. And then she turned around and she said, so does that scare you? And the girl said, well, no. She said, well, how do I scare you? And she said, well, if you scare me, I might not come back. And Deja went, but she was all about Alexa and trying to scare somebody, and she's three. She's three. So, yeah.
That's funny. What do you guys think might be the trends of this group? Do they seem to be idealistic? Yeah. No. Do they seem to be kids that'll take a situation and run with it and try and change things? Who knows?
They'll
It's hard to
probably
know.
use robots.
I'm sorry, what?
They'll probably use robots.
Yeah. Yeah, as comfortable as they are with all of that. Yeah. I think it's going to be really interesting to see where technology goes as this group matures on into adulthood and becomes the generation that leads society in general.
This could be the generation that will go to Mars.
Could be.
In spacecraft.
Could be. Could be. So let's talk a little bit about perceptions. So when Americans talk, last thing I'm going to read out of this book. When Americans talk of generations, they like to associate them with hopes for progress, in particular with the American dream that each successive generation will fare better over time. And for a while, that was how it worked. Until I think the boomers messed it up. The very concept of a historical cycle may seem to threaten these hopes in this dream. If history runs in circles, after all, how can it move forward? As the generational biographies have shown, however, our cycle is perfectly compatible with the progress of civilization by any standard normally used to measure it, material, spiritual, social, or cultural. As the cycle explains, is when and why the different generations apply different standards in working toward progress. So the idea is the generational patterns follow time after time after time, but because people change and because we change how we look at these things, rather than being a repeating cycle that can never change. Change happens. So we all have perceptions, right? And perceptions affect how we deal with each other. Perceptions are often negative. And speaking generationally, these preconceived beliefs and perceptions can be a barrier to working together for the common good, which is the reason for looking at the different generations. So it's really important to be aware of our biases and figure out how we can move beyond them. So these are some perceptions that have been listed. Perceptions of the silent generation by those younger. We kind of don't think about them and think they're irrelevant, and some of the younger ones think they're hypocrites because they saw things that they didn't think were right. Boomers are thought of as rebellious, naive, self-indulgent, resented, self-centered, but their joy in life is appreciated. Generation X, they think they're totally crazy, hard to understand, apathetic, and melancholy. Millennials are thought of as shallow but driven, but clever and resourceful. And Generation Z, we look at them and say, well, they're just buried in technology. And those are all, most of them are kind of negative perceptions and biases. And it's just really important for us to look at those, acknowledge those, so we can move beyond them. Are there any other perceptions that you guys can think of that you have heard of any of those groups that might stand in the way and be barriers?
And there are two groups of millennials, the ones that are driven and the ones that aren't, and they resent each other.
Not that.
I've read that. I've also read the same that's happening to Generation Z. There's some that are very entrepreneurial, and then some that are so anxious and just paralyzed.
Right, right.
I don't know about them resenting each other.
No, but you're right. You're right. And that is something that previous generations haven't seen. Yeah, very true.
It seems like sometimes that you hear, like this is something kind of new to me, probably the last year or something I heard about, like using that boomers as a negative,
Derogatory.
like yeah. And sort of to mean like you're stubborn and you don't want to listen or some, you know, so somebody to.
Right.
Sometimes you're a Karen.
I know, so I was going to say you're either a boomer named Karen.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Like
you're
kind of
right.
Stubborn and stuck in your rut.
Right.
Others.
So I wish I can't remember what it is, but this book also calls boomers something else. And I can't remember, and it's not so derogatory that I didn't use it because nobody knows who it would be. So, all right, so let's look at a few things about that we need to remember when we are working with people of generations other than our own. So when working with the two oldest generations, remember they don't always need assistance when looking at new things or technologies. And we need to look at the individual needs rather than assume. Ask them to reflect upon their strategies that were previously effective. So even though they may not have the technological expertise or whatever, they still are pretty experienced at problem solving. So that might be a strategy. Since in general, those two generations didn't grow up multitasking, too much variety at once will usually be met with pushback. And so that's something important to remember. And when discussing change, be methodical. Don't throw everything at once. So remember, when working with the baby boomers, we like collaboration. So provide as much choice and opportunity as possible for input and feedback. And through collaboration, this generation can best utilize their unique and personal talents and skills. And they don't have to be leaders, but they can definitely be integral parts of the group. So in working with Generation X, so because of their perceived failure of previous generations, they're often skeptical of the establishment, and they're idealistic, but they sometimes need structure and direction and need to be given tasks. And because things are so immediate for them, they need to see results quickly. So they often get frustrated with how slow things change around here. Well, not just around here, but in general. And help them see how short-term decisions will affect future outcomes. Because sometimes it's hard to see past here if we're trying to make some changes and see how it's going to look globally. When working with millennials, they see possibility for change but don't always know how to go about it. So point out strengths and offer decision empowerment. And specifically for us older folks, don't dismiss opportunities for connection just because they don't look like what we grew up with. I think that's a real important thing with these younger groups. And when working with Gen Z, unlike older generations, Gen Z can take information in quickly, and they will likely grow bored if it's too drawn out, despite our best intentions. So we need to think about that and also take advantage of their ability to think virtually. So something that really hit me when preparing for this was this idea of reduced eye contact. Because when I grew up, if you were not looking directly at the person who you were speaking to, then you were being disrespectful or you were showing that you were disinterested. Well, because this generation is so technologically driven and can multitask really, really well, much better than we can in older generations, their reduced eye contact is really more a tendency to multitask than it is a sign of disrespect or disinterest. So I think that's something important for us to remember when we're sitting in groups of people from the younger generations, that even though they may be on their phone doing something, it may be that they're looking something up in reference to whatever it is that we're discussing. So it's important to remember. And I have no information on what to remember when working with Generation Alpha, because it's just not out there. So, does anybody have any questions or comments? Anything that you know about any of those generations that did not get covered that would be important for us to know when working together? Okay.
You're talking about multitasking.
Mm-hmm.
I remember older ladies that could knit and talk at the same time. That's multitasking.
That is multitasking.
One thing I noticed just with being my parent, teaching or young adults, but working with maybe volunteering at school or in Sunday school or something, like kids do have a lot more knowledge than they know what the wisdom is. Like just kind of be patient with that, or
Right.
but they do know a lot of things, and then with kids, I think that are in grade school now know a lot more than I knew in grade school,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't always know what to do with all of that information.
Exactly.
Or sometimes they have even know more about subjects they probably ought not to know about. But I don't know, that's just something to think about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. So I am looking forward to next week. Colin and Marla from two different generations are going to be talking to you guys about technology, and I've been peripherally in on some of that, so I think it'll be enjoyable.
There's a whole nother discussion of music generationally.
Uh-huh,
And not just taste in music, but the ways that generations use music.
mhm,
Some people have to have music playing in order to concentrate, others have to turn their music down to think. You know, I mean, it's, and I don't know if that's as generational as it is personal.
and it may be a little bit of both.
Yeah.
You know, Colin and I have been talking, and I may be, what do you wanna say?
No,
I
go
may be
ahead.
saying what you want, and you say it so much better than
I don't even know if we're gonna say the same thing. Based on Mark's comment, I was gonna ask if there was anything in your research that cross-referenced mind styles in the
No.
generations.
No, not mine style specifically, but the disclaimer, if you will, or the conversation about remembering these are generational trends, that these are not saying everybody's gonna be lockstep. So yeah, kind of, I was gonna talk about sort of that. When Colin and I have conversations about, you know, new things that either of us are learning about typical males or typical females or generational stuff, we're often struck by, we're really more an anomaly. Like when we were young marrieds, we went to a lot of these weekend retreat things, you know, and so they would say, okay guys, you need to listen to this because the women are all gonna da 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 da. And women, you need to understand that your husband will just da 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 da, and we traded places. We really, because, you know, I don't know if you've heard the analogy of men's minds are like waffles, and they have a little box, and they think in that one box, and then women's minds are like spaghetti. Well, I'm the waffle and he's the spaghetti. So, but that was way off discussion, I'm sorry. Other than to say, just because it was up here on the screen does not mean it's exactly you. It's just, when we're having discussions about change and when we're having discussions and trying to get to know each other better, it's always a good idea to keep these perceptions of generations and what they mean in the back of our minds, so that can better inform how we work with each other. Yes?
I have something anecdotal to relate, and I wonder if this is, I mean, it could be more apparent than real, but I started working at Piedmont Schools in 2003, and they had a year-end talent show, and there were always a lot of garage bands, a lot of student bands, and I had a faculty band. Well, the faculty band was one of about 4 or 5 or 6 bands that would play. And I did that for a number of years, but I noticed there were fewer bands every year. I went back 5 years after I left to play one more time with the faculty band, and I said, I don't need to bring my amp in, I can just plug into one of your other bands. And the Stuco sponsor, who I'd known all this time, said, well, interesting you should ask, y'all are the only band. I said, what? She said, yeah, there aren't garage bands anymore. She says, no, we have a few singers, but they sing karaoke. And I just, and
Interesting.
apparently the involvement in extracurricular activities had declined for
Yeah.
years as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, and now, you know, with the pandemic, that's brought a whole nother thing, speaking of bands. Our youngest daughter is a flautist, and she has gotten into an Oklahoma virtual band. And so everybody is learning this piece of music on their own, and there's a metronome, so everybody's gonna be doing it at the same pace. And when they, at some date, they're all going to send their recording, I was gonna say tapes, but that wasn't it. Their recordings of their pieces into this main clearinghouse, and this person will put everything together, and it will be an entire orchestra. And that's just something we wouldn't have heard of even 10 years ago, I don't think. So I think it's awesome.
I made a mix CD for Blake last week, and I handed it to him, and he kind of laughed. I think I've got a CD player somewhere.
CD. Well, and you know what's really funny, Colin? I was waiting for the punchline. I didn't understand why that was funny until CD, okay, that was really nice. Okay, if there are no other comments, I'm done. Thank you so much.